complex and complicated person there. But I was wrong, because your story and everything I've heard in these weeks of press about the book tells me that I'm wrong, and that there's quite a lot of complexity there after all. What was your instinct? What was your reporter, journalist instinct that told you early on, as you were signing the contract, that there was a good story here?
Well, I think it was, I mean, just knowing how much of an impact he had on immigration from like reading profiles about him. And then I just became fascinated with him as a character, learning that he was a descendant of refugees, you know, Jewish refugees who came here fleeing persecution. And for me, that mystery of trying to understand how does a person go from, you know, being the descendant of people who came to this country fleeing violence and persecution, how does that person end up becoming the architect of Trump's harshest rhetoric and policies targeting people fleeing violence and persecution? And that's one thing that, you know, I knew from having been an immigration reporter under the Trump administration, that like the primary targets under the Trump administration have been asylum seekers and refugees, families who have broken no laws, with the exception in some cases, the misdemeanor of illegal entry. But most of those families, when I spoke to them, you know, they if they crossed illegally, it was only because they were being turned away at the ports of entry. And here we have the busiest border crossing in the country. And you know, I just kept witnessing this disconnect between what was happening on the ground and what the White House was saying. You know, the White House kept saying this is about law and order, this is about keeping out criminals and cartels, this is about national security. But here I was at the port of entry, and I knew that most of the people who were being impacted by the policies were families fleeing violence, seeking legal pathways into this country. And when I realized that the person who was designing the policies that were impacting them and harming them in many ways, sometimes systematically, when I realized that that person was a descendant of refugees, I felt like there was absolutely a book there, and that I had to find out how does that happen.
So people can be forgiven if they don't know the name Stephen Miller, because there've been so many people coming and going from the Trump administration, from the Trump White House in this first term. You know, so many people, revolving door at chief of staff, at other offices. So what's your best answer to that question? Who is Stephen Miller? How would you describe Stephen Miller? For those folks who aren't familiar with him, who is Stephen Miller?
Yeah, so Stephen Miller is officially the longest lasting advisor in the White House outside of the president's own family. You know, he outlasted stalwarts like his former boss, Jeff Sessions, who was the Attorney General. He outlasted his former mentor, Steve Bannon, who was recently arrested. He outlasted all of these people who were deemed to be critical to the Trump administration. And he is essentially the top speechwriter, as well as the person who's in charge of immigration policy. And right now what I see is he's dictating the re-election strategy. So his power, you know, when I first started writing this book, I was writing it from the perspective of an immigration reporter, and I was trying to understand how did Stephen Miller impact our immigration policy. And then as I learned more and more about him, I realized that this is actually a lot bigger than the immigration issue. Stephen Miller has his hands in so much more than the immigration issue. The entire issue of national security is, you know, what we're seeing with national security is tied to Stephen Miller. A lot of the White House officials who I spoke to for the book tell me that because of Stephen Miller's obsession with keeping out families from Latin America and from Africa, we ended up more vulnerable to real threats like domestic terrorism, like the cyber warfare, like the pandemic. And this is because, you know, from day one, Stephen Miller began to invert the power structure at the Department of Homeland Security, so that, you know, what the Department of Homeland Security that we see today, almost all of the top leadership positions are vacant or held by people in acting capacity. So regardless of whether you care about the immigration issue, Stephen Miller is impacting your life through the Homeland Security question. And the fact is, you know, he is a public relations flack who at the age of 31 was put in charge of making policies for this country without any prior policy experience. And this is why we see the crises that we see today. And what I tell people is that if you want to understand, you know, the disaster that is 2020, you have to understand the story of Stephen Miller.
So I'm fascinated by what you said about immigration. It goes beyond immigration. There's some folks who would characterize him as, I care about immigration, so I care about Stephen Miller. But I like what I've heard from you in the past about the culture war aspect of what's going on in America now. You see with the George Floyd killing in Minneapolis at the hands of police officers, the riots that ensued, the social unrest. There's a whole other debate that's begun in America. It's spun off this other thing, American versus American. It's not about immigration anymore. This is a homegrown civil war. And one of the flashpoints, Gene, was the president's 4th of July speech at Mount Rushmore, where he talked about how basically told the crowd, there are people out there who want to take down our statues and our heritage and destroy America. And there were some folks immediately who said, aha, Stephen Miller is back. That speech has Stephen Miller written all over it. To speak to that, how Miller has inserted himself in culture war.
Yeah, well, whenever you hear Donald Trump use phrases like unhinged left-wing mob or far-left fascism, or, conflating Black Lives Matter protesters with agitators and anarchists who want to destroy this country, that is Stephen Miller. And it's Stephen Miller taking language directly from white supremacist books and literature. One book in particular called The Camp of the Saints that Stephen Miller promoted in 2015, it's about the destruction of the white world after brown refugees described as monsters and beasts and teeming ants, as in very dehumanizing terms. After these refugees allegedly destroy the country in partnership with anti-racist protesters who are described as agitators and anarchists and unhinged mobs of people. So this is language that, it's not dog whistling anymore. I mean, Stephen Miller is pulling language that comes directly from the white supremacist conspiracy theory of white genocide, and he's slightly tweaking it so that it appeals to the mainstream. And the way he tweaks it is that instead of talking about race, instead of talking about skin color, he launders these ideas through the language of heritage, or the language of national security, or the language of keeping America safe or protecting America's economy. So he uses all of the same language except for when it comes to talking specifically about race. But that's what these theories come from white supremacist literature, as I try to show in the book, connecting the dots between the rhetoric that he is inserting into Trump's speeches and also the policies that he's pulling directly from think tanks that, as I show in the book, these are think tanks that were created by eugenicists who believe specifically in population control for non-white people and believe in the genetic superiority of whites. So, in 2000,
talking about John Tanton.
John Tanton, yeah, an eye doctor who, created the Federation for American Immigration Reform. He got the funding for the Center for Immigration Studies, and all of these think tanks that have sort of legitimized themselves in the public view. You see journalists quoting them regularly. These were created with the idea of finding a way to have population control for non-white people, because these people believe that if you have too many brown and black people in the United States, that you're going to see some kind of end to civilization, which is an idea that was prevalent in the California of Stephen Miller's youth, which I delve into in the book. And that's sort of where it comes from. California was a microcosm for what we're seeing nationally today, blaming everything on immigrants. And I can talk more about that later, but.
I do want to ask you about California, but first, you mentioned the terms about black and brown. You talk about the book that portrays minorities as insects and animals and the like. So it leads me to this question that just overhangs your book. It's always there. Is, in your opinion, is Stephen Miller racist? And is it fair to call him racist and to say that particularly he's racist against Mexicans and beyond that, Mexican Americans, people like myself and you and our friends and people who live here in San Diego? Is he racist against Mexicans and Mexican Americans?
So as journalists, we're always very careful about using terms like racist, and we're told never to use words like racist because you don't know what is in, or at least we're told not to call a person racist because you do not know what is in their heart. But at the same time, there are some people who argue that racism is about word and deed. And if you think about it that way, countless people who I interviewed over the course of Stephen Miller's life have seen him do and say racist things, you know, telling his Mexican classmates in high school to go back to their countries, telling them, you know, to speak English and to stop speaking Spanish. You know, and it goes back all the way to high school, but you see him continuing through today, you know, encouraging Trump to use words like, you know, shithole countries and things like that, you know, language that is extremely offensive to the, you know, Latin American community. And so in that sense, then I think that you could call Stephen Miller a racist. I mean, we decided to use the title hate monger because, you know, while I can't tell you if Stephen Miller hates Mexicans or hates Muslims or hates anyone, what I can tell you is that Stephen Miller is fluent in hate. He's fluent in the language of hate. He directly communicates with people who hate, and he deliberately incites hatred as a political strategy, you know, and this is something that I can say confidently because of strategy papers that I've viewed and which I reference in the book, in which they discuss, you know, the political utility of hate and fear. This is what they've been doing since 2016. You know, Stephen Miller is the architect of the 2016 campaign, its use of white fear to rally people around Donald Trump. In 2016, it was about, you know, creating this idea that the Democratic Party posed an existential threat to civilization because of their support for mass migration. Now it's about demonizing the entire Democratic Party because of their support for Black Lives Matter. And so even though they say it has something to do with race, it always goes back to race.
You mentioned two parts of Miller's biography. He's from California. In fact, he grew up, he's only a year or two older than you, as I recall. You're very much contemporaries. Literally, you grew up about 2 hours apart from each other, 2.5 hours. He grew up in Santa Monica. You grew up in San Diego. So I want to talk about him being from California and what that meant. And I also want to talk about something else you mentioned, the fact that he's Jewish. Let's start with the second one first. So he is Jewish. I know that his uncle in particular has been critical, basically saying that Stephen Miller ought to know better, because if you study the history of the Jewish people going back over 5,000 years, these are the ultimate scapegoats. These are the people that were picked on, blamed for everything, run out of various places. I've talked to Jewish friends who said they were raised to keep their passports handy because they didn't know when the mood was going to turn and they were going to be blamed and have to leave. So my question to you is, how does that play into the story? The fact that he's Jewish, did that create any kind of tension at all? And I kind of want to think to myself, shouldn't he have known better? It sounds a bit counterintuitive that you would take this position.
Right. I mean, he uses language, you know, like he uses the term cosmopolitan bias in one of these press briefings. And this is a term that used historically to demonize the Jewish people, the Jewish community. And so he's pulling ideas, rhetoric, policies directly from groups that have historically wanted to do violence to Jewish people. So it is something that I explore in the book. You know, one of his aunts told me that she thinks that Stephen Miller should be tried for crimes against humanity because he has, in her mind, opened a Pandora's box of hatred that is ultimately going to result in, you know, people of color as well as Jewish people being harmed. And we already see that happening today. You know, the El Paso shooter last August, killing 23 people, thinking that he was rescuing the country from a quote unquote Hispanic invasion, the same language that Stephen Miller has been inserting into Trump's speeches from these white supremacist books. But the other thing is that's fascinating to me is that, you know, for the most part, Stephen Miller comes from a family that, as you say, like they were very conscious of where they came from. His maternal grandmother, Ruth, spent her retirement documenting the family history so that her grandchildren, like Stephen Miller, would never forget the value of people who come to this country with nothing but the clothes on their back and speaking no English. And she recorded this also, like she talked about the dangers of demonization and nationalist agitators. And all of these lessons are lessons that Stephen Miller completely disregarded and in fact spent his life attacking. And you know, one of the first questions I would ask Stephen Miller if he would speak to me, which he has declined to do for this book, is what does he think about these lessons that his grandmother recorded for him, and did he attempt to speak with her as she was on her deathbed this year, as she was dying of the coronavirus? Unfortunately, she passed away, this summer, and I really wonder about that family dynamic.
Also, the geography fits into the storyline, into Stephen Miller's storyline, because he is from California. And I get the message loud and clear in reading your book, that Stephen Miller would not be who he is had he been born in Nebraska or in Boston. That California really is in his DNA. And what's interesting is people forget what California was like in the early 1990s and during the debate over Prop 187, for instance, in 1994. This is a ballot initiative that was on the California ballot that would have denied education, social services, and non-emergency health care to illegal immigrants and their children. And it was as divisive a ballot initiative. It was a very ugly time. During that year, I was 26 years old, and I was on the radio in Los Angeles hosting a radio show every single night, hearing earfuls about Prop 187. And you and Stephen Miller were much younger in 1994, but you were absorbing that, and I take it in very different ways. Tell me about California as it relates to Stephen Miller, and how his upbringing affected his politics in his world.
Right. Well, he came of age at a time when, as you say, there was this unprecedented anti-immigrant hostility. You had statewide bipartisan attacks on social services for undocumented migrants and their children. You had bipartisan attacks on bilingual education. You had bipartisan attacks on affirmative action. And I remember myself, as the daughter of a Mexican immigrant and a Puerto Rican mother, internalizing some of that white supremacist rhetoric. I remember there was this real sense of shame with being Mexican, and people wanted to hide that they were Mexican, and Mexican restaurants would advertise their food as Hispanic, or, and my mother used to tell me, you're not Mexican, you're not Puerto Rican, you're American. And I, in retrospect, I realized that it's because she wanted me to feel a sense of belonging and to be seen as belonging in a way that she hadn't been, with her Puerto Rican accent. And so in that sense, I approached Stephen Miller from I could empathize with the young Stephen Miller who wanted to be perceived as American with all of the privileges that is supposed to guarantee. I empathize with the young Stephen Miller who is, listening to these right-wing talk show hosts, Rush Limbaugh, Larry Elder in LA, blaming all of the state's problems on multiculturalism, painting multiculturalism as some kind of existential threat to civilization. The difference is, Stephen Miller continues to sound the same today as he did when he was 16. And so I wanted to understand that. How is it that he became more and more entrenched in this ideology, which is exactly what happened. I mean, I speak to his friends, and his friends tell me, back in high school, he would say these outrageous things, but it was kind of almost a joke. People weren't sure whether to take him seriously. He had this lightheartedness to him, which he no longer has, because he's invested so much over the years in this ideology that it has become inseparable from his identity. And he is now a true radical, a true fanatic. He's an extremist in the White House, one of the few true ideologues who believe every word of what he's saying, where he believes that by systematically targeting communities of color, he's somehow doing a service. Right. The American people. But I see it as a case study in indoctrination. Early on in his life, he was feeling vulnerable. His family had lost a lot of money related to his father's real estate company. His dad was tangled up in all sorts of lawsuits and bankruptcies, and so they had to move to a slightly less affluent part of town. And so he fits the profile of someone who would be radicalized. He's feeling displaced, he's feeling lost, he's feeling angry. And this is when people like David Horowitz, a ex-Marxist turned right-wing radical, come into his life and give him this framework for understanding what is going on in his life by blaming everybody else. And in this case, it was blaming immigrants. So Stephen Miller learned how to scapegoat at the same time that, Californians learned how to scapegoat. They learned to blame all of their problems on immigrants and on multiculturalism. Right. But unlike California, which saw this huge mobilization of the Latin American community after that, when Latin American families realized that they had to organize in order to avoid, systemic violence to their communities. And then we saw California turn deep blue. Stephen Miller just kept doubling down, tripling down. And I could talk a little bit more later about how that mentality of doubling and tripling down is part of what makes Trump, really appreciate Stephen Miller. They sort of get each other in the same way.
Well, yes, I want to talk about that. That's a fascinating part of your book about why it is that Stephen Miller, I mean, the question is often put to you, I think it was put to you during your interview on Morning Joe on NBC, on MSNBC, where they said, why is that Stephen Miller, is almost bulletproof? Everybody else is fired. They're humiliated and sent out the door, but not him. He'll never be fired. And you said, and you continue to say, Stephen Miller gets Donald Trump. And I think it's fair to say that Donald Trump gets Stephen Miller. They have an understanding of one another. I remember reading that part of your book where you talked about what was going on in California in 1994 in the early 90s. And in the margins, I wrote this idea of victimhood. This is where we came along with the idea of victimhood. And it's easy enough to say scapegoating, and you and I have both used that word. But my kids are 11, 13, and 15 years old. If somebody asked me what's the most difficult thing about raising children, I'd say this: getting them to take responsibility when things go wrong, okay? They are marinating in these juices in American society where it's always somebody else's fault.
Exactly,
okay?
Yeah.
If you're an unemployed steel worker in Iowa or in Ohio, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. It's the company, it's the rich guy, it's the big guy, it's Mexico, it's the trade deals. And that I wrote in the margins of your book because Stephen Miller in 1994, that's what that was all about, as I recall. It was, oh, are you having a tough time? The economy's bad. Oh, it's not your fault. Maybe you should have gone to graduate school. Maybe you should have worked harder in school and been smarter. Not your fault. It's these immigrants that are coming in and taking jobs. Either high-skilled immigrants from India or low-skilled immigrants who are coming in and pushing up the bottom. And that is something that we see now in the Trump administration, with this mentality that they go around the country and tell people, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. So it's very interesting how you can draw a straight line between California in the early 90s to the Trump White House. And that line is made up of sort of absolving people of their responsibility.
Which is funny. They're obsessed with this idea of self-reliance, but it's
for other people.
But it's exactly.
For other people. For other people. I always write about victimhood, and I always come back to the fact that the biggest victims I see are white men, and they're the most often to say that everybody else is playing the victim, but they play it well. My last question on this thread is, why do you think Donald Trump, having been elected, in large part because of the immigration issue? I think if he's reelected, he'll be reelected for other reasons, not immigration, but clearly in 2016, that was his signature issue, and the idea of building the wall. He takes that issue and hands it over to Stephen Miller, lock, stock, and barrel. I mean, he just says, you're in charge. Mm-hmm. Why do you think Donald Trump would give Miller complete authority over his signature issue? Not be the least bit protective of it? Don't hurt it? Here it is. He took his baby and handed it right over. Why do you think that was?
Well, it's because of the fact that Donald Trump didn't have any immigration policy plans. I mean, it was a main theme of his campaign, but the only plan that he had was the border wall. And people who follow the immigration issue closely kind of rolled their eyes at that because they knew, we've been building border walls since the 90s, and it hasn't done much other than reroute traffic into other parts of the border, underground, into the ocean, into the desert, into the airports, which is where a majority of the traffic comes through. And so it wasn't until Stephen Miller in 2015, so before he was even officially hired by Donald Trump, Stephen Miller was super excited about the idea of a Trump presidency, and he starts to contribute free labor to Donald Trump. And one of the things that he does, in addition to sending over talking points, is he sends him an immigration policy plan. And the plan included all sorts of immigration policies that got restrictionists really excited, because these were immigration policies that were pulled from these think tanks that I mentioned earlier that are meant for population control for non-white people. And they primarily targeted family migration. They call it chain migration. They talk about catch and release, all policies that primarily were about asylum seekers and refugees. And so all of a sudden people got really excited about Trump. Stephen Miller got him the endorsements from the Border Patrol and ICE unions, which was huge. The Border Patrol and ICE had never endorsed a presidential candidate before. And this gave Trump real law and order credentials that his campaign did not have before Stephen Miller joined up. So people do not realize the extent to which Stephen Miller is responsible in many ways for Trump's win in 2016. He was there from day one, kind of pulling the strings, and I think Trump, grew to really trust his instincts, in part because he feels that he won on the immigration issue, and he knows that Stephen Miller not only brought the policies but also the rhetoric that got people really excited about him.
You give me now a great segue to a question I have about the politics of it and the White House. Would you say Stephen Miller is an asset for Donald Trump or a liability?
So this, I remember you gave this to me as a practice question once.
Did it stump you before? Because you're like,
yeah.
So there was one question I asked you where you said before, that's a good question. It kind of like stumped you. But it's hard to stump you because you've heard all these questions before. But and certainly you've done all these interviews.
I haven't been asked it since you gave this to me as a practice question. Good question.
Is he an asset or a liability? How would you see it?
So obviously, like if we're talking about the American people, I see him as a liability because a lot of the crises that we're seeing today can be traced to Stephen Miller's lack of experience and extremism, and his preference for allowing ideology over listening to the national security experts. But as far as for Donald Trump, I think he was absolutely an asset in 2016. He is the reason that Trump was elected. And I think that whether or not he's going to be an asset this November is going to be largely determined by to what extent the American people fall for the scapegoating again this time. I think that because we're in a pandemic and because people are scared enough already, fear, which Stephen Miller deliberately and consciously used in 2016, as I show in my book, like his mentor David Horowitz gave him a strategy paper about how fear is a stronger emotion than hope, and how you really need to like get people afraid. And I don't think that strategy is going to work as well this year because people are already so scared and tired, and what they're looking for is hope. And I don't think that Stephen Miller knows how to give people hope. I think that they tried a little bit of that in the Republican National Convention. There was like a mishmash of hope and fear. But I think that, my gut tells me that he's more of a liability this time around.
It's very interesting you asked that, you put it that way as well, because if you think back to the 2018 election, the midterm elections, it was clear the Democrats, I think the older I get, the longer I do this, the parties just become really predictable. The Democrats all lined up pushing healthcare as the major issue. The Republicans all pushed immigration. The Democrats won. Healthcare was the dominant issue and immigration didn't resonate. Now we're in 2020 and immigration isn't anywhere, Gene. It's nowhere. This election is going to be about what? Social unrest, racism, police violence, maybe the pandemic. Democrats want to make it about the pandemic and say Trump failed. Trump wants to make it about social unrest and say that Joe Biden can't be trusted to keep order. Nobody's talking about immigration. Why is that? What do you think is going on here that neither Donald Trump nor Joe Biden seems interested in talking about immigration?
Well, I think it's just so obvious to people, I think, at this point that their problems have very little to do with immigration. I think Stephen Miller is still pushing that idea a little bit. People are not paying as much attention. It's not in the headlines because it's not working. But Stephen Miller, the reason that they responded to the pandemic by suspending green cards and shutting down the US-Mexico border is because they were again trying to scapegoat immigrants for the pandemic, creating this idea that they need to protect American jobs due to the economic crisis stemming from the pandemic. They need to protect Americans from all the coronavirus cases in Mexico at a time when Mexico had like far fewer cases than the United States. But it's not working this time around. I think Stephen Miller is still very obsessed with the issue and working very hard to shut the door in every way that he can to immigrants. But now, you see him leaning more on his mentor, David Horowitz's idea that Black Lives Matter is a terrorist organization, is a Nazi organization. These are words that David Horowitz has used for a very long time to describe the Black Lives Matter movement. And over the years, you saw Trump be very careful about insulting the Black community in ways that did not apply to Mexicans and Latin Americans. But now, now they're changing that, and I think it's because there's unrest. There's social justice protesters in the streets who are very upset about police brutality and systemic racism, and Trump does not want to acknowledge it, but he's able to harness that for political gain by creating this false notion that there's a civil war brewing, when in fact he's the one who is deliberately breathing life into extremism by using words like agitators and anarchists to describe racial justice protesters.
I think everything you said makes sense. I think there's an added dimension as well. Joe Biden and Donald Trump have something in common. The immigration issue is problematic for them for different reasons. Joe Biden has no interest in talking about immigration, which brings you into the Obama record, which is horrible on immigration. He was the number 2 to a president who deported 3 million people, put kids in cages, separated families. And then Donald Trump would have to explain how it is he promised to build a wall along the southern border, and he's actually constructed fewer miles of border wall right now than Joe Biden voted for in 2005 when he voted for the Secure Fence Act.
Exactly.
So if anything, it looks like Joe Biden has done more for border security and wall building than Donald Trump. So neither one wants to go near this issue. It's very problematic for them. I have 2 final questions for you as we wind up. And one of them is quite a departure from anything I think you've heard. And I'm just working with it right now. In the theme, consistent with the theme that we have to take responsibility for our actions, I've turned over a new leaf now. I'm going to take responsibility for my actions from now on. And I feel like I created Stephen Miller. I feel like I contributed to the creation of Stephen Miller, because even though I'm a moderate on immigration, while California was going off the rails, I would say too far to the left, I didn't say anything. I was very quiet, okay? A lot of my friends are far, far to the left on immigration. When they started handing out driver's license to undocumented immigrants, and then had a fight over the fact that the state wanted to put a distinguishing mark on it to show that you're here undocumented. And they said, oh, no, it's got to be identical. And then when they started giving dreamers money to go to college out of the state coffers, I just think we started to push it too far. And for folks who were moderates and on the fence, this created a big army of people. We lost it. We lost the middle. And then Stephen Miller and his tribe were able to come along and tap into that. So I think everybody who's in the Stephen Miller camp on immigration, not everybody's a racist, and not everybody started out there. I think the left blew it. I think the Latino left in California blew it. I think they pushed it too far. I think the problem with living in a blue state is you get away with murder. And when you live in a red state, you get away with murder in the other direction. You pass some crazy stuff. I've lived in dark red states and I've lived in dark blue states, and neither one seems to function very well. So my question to you is it fair for me to say that I helped create Stephen Miller, I and a lot of other people, because we created this template for him, this reservoir that he could draw from by being just a little too aggressive on immigration?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. And I think that it's absolutely true. I mean, the Clinton and Bush and Obama administrations all laid the groundwork for the anti-immigration crackdown that we see today. Previous administrations kind of tried to maintain this idea of prioritization where they prioritized criminals. Obama said they was focusing on felons, not families. But what this did is that it married the concept of immigration to the concept of criminality in the public imagination, where anytime anyone was talking about immigration, it was about lawlessness, it was about illegal border crossings, and it created this hysteria that around immigrants in general, where it allowed Trump to come in and begin to systematically separate migrant children from their parents, and, you know, systematically shut down the refugee admission system where we're hitting new historic lows every year. And the United States reputation internationally as this beacon of hope and refuge, historically, it is now destroyed. It has been deliberately destroyed. And the asylum system at the US-Mexico border no longer exists. But all of these things were possible because of the fact that, you know, you had this false dichotomy created between legal and illegal immigration that just ended up associating all immigration with criminality. And I think that Stephen Miller, because he grew up in a blue state, well, it turned blue when he was a teenager, but because he grew up around a lot of liberals, he understands liberal hypocrisy. He's able to point out selective outrage when he sees it. He knows that a lot of the people who speak out against immigration today, or I'm sorry, against his immigration policies today, were for similar immigration policies yesterday. And
they were quiet. Yeah, they were quiet when Obama did it.
And so one of the things I try to show in the book is that, you know, Stephen Miller his ideology is the logical outcome of a decades-long bipartisan assault on the immigrant community. And until we reckon with that reality as a nation, we are going to continue to see Stephen Millers come into power, and people are going to rally around them and think that what they're pushing is going to have a benefit for them, when in fact, you know, it's doing the opposite.
Final question. I know Julie and our friends at Warwick are going to join us shortly and see if there are any questions from the audience. But first, my final question to you is, given all the press you've done, given all the interviews you've done, national, local interviews, you've been asked lots of questions. Has there been one question that you've been waiting to be asked that you weren't asked? Can you think of a question that you haven't been asked, or maybe haven't been asked very often, that you'd like to answer for us now? So what have people not asked you about that you thought they might?
Well, you know, people haven't really asked me about, you know, the role that I believe that the media has played in all of this. And I think that, you know, you know, I worked in newsrooms where I was encouraged as a reporter to run background checks on my immigrant sources and on my sources of color. And I was never encouraged to do the same for my white sources. And there's a lot of, you know, unreckoned with racism in progressive newsrooms. And I think that is reflected in the way that we talk about Trump's immigration agenda. Nobody is calling it what it actually is, which is a white nationalist agenda. Whether or not Stephen Miller wants to identify as a white nationalist or not is, to me, irrelevant. The fact of the matter is that the agenda that he is implementing is a white nationalist agenda. And this is all you have to do to figure that out is connect the dots between these policies and where he's pulling them from. And you begin to see that it's indisputable. His goal is re-engineering the ethnic flows of people into this country to keep brown and black people out, because he was radicalized at a very young age to believe that these people pose an existential threat to civilization. It doesn't have anything to do with national security, except in as far as he believes that national security and demographics are interlinked. And I think that it's been a failure of our newsrooms to not call it out for what it is, and partly it's, you know, a lack of education, a lack of not education, but like, people just don't understand white supremacy. People still think that, you know, Trump is dog whistling, that Stephen Miller is dog whistling. It's not dog whistling anymore. They're using the same language as white supremacists. And I think we need to acknowledge that.
You know, it's fair to say this about you. It's a very brave position you've taken. You say that in media, you know, and reporters are typically taught not to use the word racist. You put out a book called HATEMONGER, and the subtitle is Stephen Miller, Donald Trump, and the White Nationalist Agenda. Okay, you went on national television and said so. And what a lot of people don't know, and what I tell people whenever they ask about you, is I said, you know, this is somebody who's taken a lot of grief. She gets threats. She's had trolls. She's had people attack her. I mean, you've had no less than the Cabinet Secretary of Homeland Security, designated Cabinet Secretary Chad Wolf, come after you directly and basically say he was going to ruin your reputation. This is how you know you're doing something right in our business. This is why they call it journalism and not public relations, because you're pissing off powerful people who can hurt you. And I think that's great. I think that's, I commend you for it. I'm proud of you for it. I call Jean Mija because I'm practically old enough to be her dad. And I'm just so proud of you and the stuff you've done. It's been my great pleasure to be with you here with this audience for Warwick. We want to thank Jean Guerrero, the author of the new book, HATEMONGER. Pick it up at Warwick. She was over at the bookstore signing some copies just the other day. More copies will be coming in. And Jean has very graciously said she'll go back and sign more copies. So with that, that concludes our program. Thank you for joining.
All right, we've got a couple, we have some great comments that came in. Jean, you can look, I mean, just talking about how this is an important conversation that needs to be had, and they were thanking us for having this, with having you too. So that was a great comment. So we have one question, and you kind of answered it, but if you want to expand on it a little bit more, how would you compare Mr. Trump's policy on Latino immigration to that of Mr. Obama?
Well, so Obama had, I mean, he was known as the deporter in chief. We saw record deportations under Obama, and I spent my first year as an immigration reporter interviewing those people. You know, most of them were men who had committed crimes, mostly drug-related crimes, DUIs, and things like that. And they'd been separated from their families, you know, their children in the United States. But there was still this emphasis on people who have committed crimes, whether you agree with it or not. You know, that was the emphasis, and that was also the guidance that the entire Department of Homeland Security was given. You know, do not prioritize everybody, but prioritize people who've committed crimes. With Donald Trump, from day one, because of Stephen Miller, you know, one of the first executive orders that Stephen Miller wrote was, we do not have prioritization here anymore. Go after everyone, every single immigrant, detain, deport. And this is why you saw all of a sudden, you know, families who'd never been targeted before being systematically targeted.
The question was for Gina, but if I could jump in here, one of the things that's interesting is, you know, it's the people who write the laws. Depending on how they write the law, you can make anything illegal. If you are deported from the country, it's a civil violation, but if you come back a second time, you've committed a felony.
Oh,
some people in La Jolla and Carlsbad would be shocked to know that they have felons doing their housekeeping for them, because these people didn't do anything back and forth. And so I remember the tamale lady outside in Sacramento. She was selling tamales outside of a Walmart in Sacramento, and she was detained because she didn't have a permit by the Sacramento Police Department, who handed her over to ICE, and they quickly deported her. And she's one of those hardened criminals that Barack Obama deported.
Shaking your head. Okay, another question came in. At bottom, what do you think is Miller's motivation? Also, has he had any role in Israeli policy?
So the latter part of that question is a really good question, and I was puzzling it the entire time I was reporting this, trying to get to the bottom of it. I wasn't able to show a link between him and policy in Israel, but I do know that it's an obsession that he's had since college. You know, one of the first things he did at Duke University was to protest the Palestine Solidarity Movement conference, and you know, he led this thing called the Terrorism Awareness Project, where they conflated Palestinians and Muslims and Arabs with terrorists. And so it's something that he's very passionate about, but I don't know to what extent he actually has an impact on that policy. You know, he's a senior policy advisor, and although his obsession is immigration, I would not be surprised at all if he was weighing in on that issue as well. But as far as what motivates him, I think, you know, Stephen Miller initially was trying to get attention as a young man. He found that by expressing conservative, very conservative, far right views, that he got attention. And then I think over the years, it became a true, case of extremism and fanaticism, where he believed, like, now what motivates him is this idea that he's saving the United States by keeping brown and black people out and by systematically harming these communities. So I think it's changed over time, and it's become increasingly, extremism that motivates him.
Okay, another question came in. Thanks for your comments on Obama and liberals turning a blind eye on immigration during Obama-Biden era. Appreciate your great reporting. What do you think immigration asylum policy will look like under Biden-Harris? Similar to Obama?
Well, I don't think we're going to see the mass deportations that we saw under Obama, because Obama did have such a backlash for that. And, he tried to reverse a little bit on that. And part of the reason he had those record deportations was because he was trying to rally support for bipartisan immigration reform. He thought that by really cracking down on immigrants who had committed crimes, that the Republican Party would come to the table and agree to protect dreamers, people who were brought here as children. That was a faulty calculation on his part. It did not work out for him, partly because Stephen Miller was in Congress at the time and was working very hard to derail that bipartisan immigration reform. But anyway,
explain that. Jane, explain that. Stephen Miller was in Congress how?
Yeah, he was communications director for Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions at the time, and there was this historic immigration reform compromise where they were going to further militarize the border, but also provide a legal pathway for people who are in this country illegally, and it was a bipartisan compromise, and Stephen Miller really just came after it, demonizing it, saying that it was going to decimate America, that it was that globalist elites were behind it, and all kinds of lies and misleading interpretations of it. Collaborating with right-wing media, with Fox News, with Breitbart, with combative personalities like Ann Coulter and Tucker Carlson, who he had relationships with, to create this idea, and that ultimately destroyed that compromise. But I think under Biden, we're not going to see the record deportations, but I also don't think we're going to see all of the things that Stephen Miller did reversed immediately. It's going to take a very long time to rebuild the refugee admission system, and I don't think that this is going to be a priority for Joe Biden, because there's just so many other things that the American people want to prioritize right now. Although, he is going to be getting pressure from the Latino community to reverse some of these things, like, for example, the Migrant Protection Protocols program, where they send every asylum seeker back into Mexico. I think they're going to probably reverse that pretty quickly.
And I want to say, I think the conversation may be academic, because I'm not convinced we'll see a Biden-Harris administration, period. They still have to win an election.
That's
true. The interesting story at the moment is that Trump's support among Hispanics is going up almost inexplicably, and Biden's support is going down.
Yeah.
Very, very good point.
Yeah, exactly.
On that note, Ruben.
On that cheery note, sorry.
On that cheery note.
I just one cheery note that I want to plug Ruben, because I have been so terrified of public speaking my whole journalistic career, and Ruben, fix that for me. So if anybody needs public speaking or guidance in that regard, Ruben is your man. And
that leads me to those. Yeah, that is a great plug, and that leads me to the final questions here. First, I was going to ask. There's some other questions that didn't get answered. Jean, if you feel like going into the comments later and looking, you can actually go and do that if you'd like. Sorry to everybody if we didn't get to your question. Any final things that you want to say, Jean, about the book, about anything? No,
if I think it's really important that people educate themselves ahead of the election, and Stephen Miller, he's not getting as much attention right now because he's kind of trying to lurk in the shadows, which is one of the reasons Trump really likes him, because he tries not to take credit for things, and tries to give all the credit to Donald Trump. But it's very important for people to understand that the most powerful advisor in the White House right now is a man who you know, who pulls ideas directly from white supremacists and who is sympathetic to the white supremacist movement. And people have to understand what that means and how that has an impact on Homeland Security overall.
Ruben, maybe your final words are vote.
My final words, yeah, are read. I think most importantly, read. Go to bookstores like Warwick's, read what's online, read newspapers, read digital stories, consume podcasts. This is really the wrong time to disconnect. And I know that since we are flooded with information and we walk around with our phones and we have the world at our fingertips, it just gets exhausting sometimes because we are, as has been said, we are information rich and knowledge poor. We don't spend enough time understanding the context of what we're digesting, right? This is really the wrong time and a really dangerous time to unplug and disconnect. So by all means, keep reading books like HATEMONGER by Jean Guerrero, and anything else you find at Warwick, a lot of good stuff there to pick up for sure. And that's, I think, what we need to do. We need to be much more engaged as citizens because it's a very dangerous time.
Agreed. Ruben, to Jean's point, how should people get in touch with you? What's your favorite mode of, speaking of social media and doing too much?
Yes, you can find me on Twitter and Facebook. You can subscribe to my weekly newsletter and keep track of me and all my columns there. You can visit me at rubennaverrette.com and just Google my name and follow the arrows. They'll be coming at me from both directions.
Excellent. And Jean, how can people find you? What's your favorite mode of communicating with people? Is it Twitter, Facebook, Instagram?
I'm on everything. My favorite is Twitter. It's Jean, JeanGuerre. And you can visit my website for more information about the book, and that's jeanguerrero.com.
All right. Okay, everybody. Thank you, everybody at Facebook, for joining us. This was an amazing conversation. Ruben, thank you for setting this up. Jean, thank you for being here. A reminder that books are available to order, the links in the chat function, so you can get them very easily there. We appreciate everybody. So
Thank
good
you
night.
very much.
Everybody go vote.
Thank you all.
Okay, live stream is